section to me, I mean, that would be, I feel, pretty difficult. With a lot of the churches today, I mean, you got people who have been coming to a church for 30, 40, 50 years, and you got people that just walk in off the street.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that's a fine balance to try to figure out how much of which one of those you would want to,
right.
partake. I mean,
So
obviously, you have to try to spread it, but.
That's exactly right. So what you got to do is you got to come to a point of understanding that preaching is for the church, and there's going to be people there who are not part of the church. So how do you mitigate some of the stuff that needs to be mitigated for the people who aren't a part of the church or who are just new in the church? But then you got to remember that preaching is not the only ministry of the church. So you got Sunday night and Wednesday night Bible study, and you've got catechism class and Sunday school class and all these other things. And what you do, in my opinion, what I think you would do is you would be good to try to get those people who maybe don't know the story so well into those as quickly as possible. And, there's this model that some churches use. It's a funnel, right? And the funnel has got a big opening at the top, but down at the bottom it narrows, right? So wherever you can get that person involved in the church, in the life and ministry of the church around that circumference of that funnel, but what you're doing is you're working them down towards that honed, discipled place where they'll be that active and engaged member in the sermon on Sunday morning. So again, I wouldn't say neglect the people on Sunday morning who don't know the stories, but just go ahead and treat them as if they're a member of the congregation and just continue on. And then hopefully, like I said, they'll, through the period of discipleship that comes from the teaching ministry of the pulpit, but also from the other ministries, maybe that would be a way to handle that. I'm not sure. But if you have a different idea, I would be certainly open for a discussion on that.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I see that in the church. I just think about, somebody that comes with no real knowledge, they're just stepping out and wanting to investigate.
Right.
And if they have no familiarity with what's being said there, and I know it's a kind of a catch-22. I mean, how do you hit every single aspect? And then that group of people that are there in that situation, they walk away and go, well, that didn't do anything for me. I don't know what. Just
exactly.
There, and that was all like listening to speak Spanish, and I don't know Spanish.
That's right.
So,
I don't see.
It's got to be hard.
I don't see why it would be wrong for a church to consider. I mean, because let's be honest, if we're going to have visitors, generally they're going to probably come on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, right, at the Sunday service. Yeah. What would be wrong with a church changing the way that it does church on Sunday morning and saying, we're going to do discipleship or Bible study, or we're going to do something that would be a seeker-sensitive type of service that we know these people who are going to be here on this Sunday are going to be unchurched. They're going to be seeking. They're going to want to learn. So let's make it more of a learning type of atmosphere, but then have a Sunday night service where the proclamation, the preaching part is more for the church and to the church, what he talks about in here. I know some churches that are doing there's some churches that actually name their church, like the time that they meet on Thursday night, like 702 Church in Kinston is they named the church because they actually started meeting at 7 o'clock but never got started until 702. So they named the church 702 Church or something like that. You know what I'm saying? So, and that's a Thursday night. That's when they worship. That's when they celebrate the ordinances of the gospel, like communion and things like that. That's their worship time. But then if they meet again on a Sunday morning, that could be more of a seeker-sensitive worship service that's designed to try to kind of more hit the entirety of the congregation. It's an option. I mean, it's at least worth a conversation.
Yeah, and I know a lot of churches I've seen. I mean, I know they do like announcements and little preface and talk about the different things that they have for, going deeper, or, if you don't understand, we have this, and
right.
Instructing you on who a church is and trying to get you familiar with them and all those types of things. It was just interesting to read those points and just kind of picture that situation and
right.
figure out that fine balance, I guess.
Well, and even in some of the things like, some of the allusions or some of the echoes, even the most biblically illiterate person would probably get it. I mean, you don't even have to know the Bible to hear a Good Samaritan and know what that means, right? I mean, that's a cultural thing. And so the people who do know the Bible, like he says, will actually kind of take the compliments. Like he's not going through and kind of unpacking the entire, story of the Good Samaritan, because he knows we know it. And so he's kind of treating us as the equals. But then that there's the guy who just wandered in off the street and he's never heard anything about the Bible at all. He's here to seek. But he's heard somebody talk about being a good Samaritan, so he knows that it has something to do with doing something good for others, kind of unselfishly or whatever. Right. So maybe that's a way forward too, is to kind of, when you do the allusions and the echoes, to do it in a way that that it's going to be something that everybody kind of would get anyway,
Yeah, sure.
The prodigal son, a lot of people that don't even know the Bible know the story of the prodigal son. What does it mean to go running off and then come back home and to be welcomed in by a loving father? Something like that.
Yep.
So good points, good comments. Anything else about that, though, about the memory part? How about recognition? Now, this is where the rubber meets the road if you're talking about real biblical preaching.
Yeah.
Because what he's saying here is that you've got to say it in such a way, as you're starting to try to figure out how to shape this message, you need to say this in such a way as that the people actually get the aha moment of, this is me, right? This is, okay, I get it now. It's not David who has been unfaithful to God with adultery to Bathsheba and killed her husband. But this is me. I am the man. Like Nathan is pointing the finger at me somehow, right? So it's like recognizing yourself in the story somehow. How do you get your congregants to kind of put themselves in the story?
Yeah, that's like on page 160. The characteristic of good preaching is to say that the nod of recognition precedes the shock of recognition.
Recognition, exactly, right. It's like, yeah, I remember this story. This is where David did such and so. And it's like, by the time the sermon is over, the person, if the sermon is good, it's kind of like the Fred Craddock sermon I sent y'all before. You're kind of like, wow, maybe I'm the guy who's misinterpreted salvation all these many years. I thought salvation meant just to get your soul saved and go to heaven when you die. I didn't know it had anything to do with healing sick people and opening blinded eyes and divesting people of their greed and all the other stuff that sermon was about, right? Mm-hmm. You kind of recognize yourself as deficient in knowing what salvation really is all about by the time he finishes that, because as you're going through, you're listening to the sermon and you're like, yeah, I remember the lady with the issue of blood. Yeah, I remember the guy who was blind, eyes matted all together. Yeah, I got the nod going, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the sermon, it was like, maybe I've not interpreted salvation as fully as I should have. So good point.
Yeah, he was good. He's got some humor to him too.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, you can tell he's a master communicator. I mean, he studied communication in his entire life.
Yeah.
And I don't know, we hadn't got to it yet, but like either in the next chapter or the one after that, he talks about, I think it's the one after that, which will be the one we talk about next week, but he talks about spending 20 minutes a day, either early in the morning or late at night, in reading the classical authors and poets and poetry and, stuff like that. That's not really even religious necessarily. Like Melville's Moby Dick or Lord of the Rings, Tolkien or whatever. And he said, it's not even just to get sermon illustrations or to get words. He said, it's more just to sit amongst the master communicators of history and listen, right? Just to be involved in that conversation, so to speak. So, good point. He talks about on page 161, sort of to do this, oftentimes we have to use evocative language. And he actually says that these kinds of things, this issue of recognition or whatever, is evoked by the good preaching, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The next sentence, it says, consistently good preaching trusts that this is so, and therefore writes checks, so to speak, on the deposits of the experience and knowledge of the people, right? The preacher does not name the dynamic at work here or call attention to it in the process of the sermon. The preacher simply does it. After all, some truths and values survive only if they are assumed. When we focus upon and analyze them, they die, not from falsity, but from too much attention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you remember last week, maybe I didn't mention this to y'all. I mentioned it to a couple of my friends because me and my friends watched this sermon. Jacob, you know Jose.
Yeah.
Me and Jose watched this sermon from Fred Craddock a couple of weeks ago, and another friend of mine watched it too. And I was like, whenever he finishes that sermon, it's like he just drops the mic. He's like, he says the last statement. He's like, I perceive that this is true. I perceive that it's the most powerful word in the world. And then he just boom, turns and walks off, right? That's sort of evocative language, right? It kind of evokes something in me. It's like, yeah, I start thinking. It's like it leaves me pondering, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what about identification? So more than just recognizing ourselves in the story, starting to identify, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see the progress of what he's doing here, right? If you go back and think about it now. So first of all, you want one theme, right? Unity. And then you want to try to help the congregation to recall memory, right? You want to help them to remember stuff, remember the story, remember the scripture. And then recognize themselves as a part of that story, and then identify that it is not just that story, but that it is a part of who I am, who are we as humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is one of those places he says you can often find how this identification is done by reading good literature of other good writers and good communicators. Because most of the stories that are really good stories, the reason they're so good is because we identify with them, right? It's like Nicholas Sparks lives here in New Bern.
Mm-hmm.
And Nicholas Sparks has written so many books that have sold so many millions of copies. He's got so much money from writing. And you ask yourself the question, why is it that Nicholas Sparks can write a book and like A Walk to Remember? Y'all know the movie or the book, Walk to Remember, right? Yeah. That's from Nicholas Sparks. And there's a bunch of other ones just like it. And if you go through and you watch those movies or you read those books, what you begin to realize is the only reason why they're selling so many copies is because it touches everybody who reads it, because everybody's had, has either fallen in love with somebody or they've been in love with somebody who got cancer and they're going to die and there's nothing you can do to stop. And it's like all these sappy stories that he's writing is just life, right? We all experience it. So how do you get people to come to the sense of identifying with the story? And he starts off by giving you like steps to consider when you're doing this, right? A, the human condition is presented with genuine insight, right? Yes, that really is the way it is. I did know someone, who understood that or felt that. Such preaching, he says, touches upon all the things that are existential in life: grief, joy, jealousy, fear, shame, anger, love, trust, betrayal, hope, countless other contours of human experiences, and holds them up in the light of God's grace. So these are the things that everybody experiences. Right. I remember one Sunday, probably one of the best homecoming messages I preached on one Sunday was Naaman, the Syrian general who got cured from leprosy. And the way I introduced that sermon, I just told a story before I even got to the scripture, right? I told everybody to turn to the passage where we were going to be reading and everything. Typical Baptist way of doing it, right? We're going to read the scripture, and then we're going to jump into the sermon. But while they were doing that, I was like, let me tell you a story, just a brief story. And I didn't tell them it was fiction. I didn't tell them it was fact. I just, after I told them the story, I told them later that it was fiction because it was one I just made up. I said, imagine you're a very successful banker on Fifth Avenue in New York, trading stocks on the stock, a stock market, stockbroker, and you make, $1 million a year. You've got a BMW, you've got an excellent health package, you've got all these things, and you went to the doctor and your doctor called you back and said, we need to come in and have a talk. We've got some distressing news from some of your test results, and come back and they tell you you've got cancer and, you're just not going to make it. You're going to die. Probably got 6 months. I said, how would you feel? Everybody in the whole room was hanging on this story because they're like, who's this guy he's talking about? Is this somebody we all know? It's like, and I'm just building up this whole idea that, in our society, cancer is the disease that if you get it, most people think, well, it's the end, it's uncurable. But then I made the jump when I actually read the scripture and said, look, there's this guy Naaman, he's a Syrian general. He's like the second in command in Syria. He's like right after the guy that's at the top, and he's got all the money, he's got all the wealth, he's got everything that's going for him in life, but he's also got leprosy, right? And in that day and time, leprosy was a death sentence. And then we talked about how you would feel if you were that stockbroker, and you went to the doctor and the doctor says, look, you can be completely healed of this and not have to have cancer. You don't have to be sick. You don't have to go through any chemo or anything. All you got to do is go jump in the Hudson River 7 times. Would you do it?
Yeah.
And it's like everybody in there is like thinking they're putting themselves in the shoes of this guy in New York. He's very powerful. He's got all this stuff, and none of that stuff can help him. The only thing that can help him is probably the most ludicrous thing you've ever heard, jumping in the river, and that's going to heal you from cancer, Right. But that's what Naaman had to do, right? So you see how I made that connection through the fear that everybody has that one day the doctor's going to call with bad news, right?
Right. Hmm.
Primary attention is given to the specific in particular rather than the general. When sermons are filled with expressions such as modern society says, scientists suggest, today's youth, what are we going to do with them? Global conflict means, it's like that is so large that it's not really packing any power punch at all, right? But if you were to say, Eric Dyson, or what's the guy's name? Is it Dyson? Not Dyson. Maybe it is. The guy who's like the nuclear physicist guy who's always interviewed about science stuff or whatever. Or what's the other guy's name? The one who just passed away, who was in the wheelchair with the funny voice. Oh, man. I'm drawing a blank on all my scientists right now. Dawkins. No, not Dawkins. Y'all know what I'm talking about there, right?
I can't think of his name.
The guy with the wheelchair, and he had I think he moved the wheelchair with his mouth because he was pretty much paraplegic from all the way down. Yeah. But he was like the smartest guy ever, right? He's like this smart scientist. So instead of saying scientists say, if you say Stephen Hawking, I think that's his name, right? Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking says, blah, 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 blah. You've gone from the general down to the specific, right? You're making a very specific claim. And that's what he's talking about here, I think, when he says life is experienced or known, not in general, but in specific. And then being realistic, not contrived, right? So like if you're telling this story, you don't want to, build that story up a whole lot bigger than that actual story is, right? Just be real. Everybody knows when you're just, distorting descriptions and narrations, as he says here. He gave a pretty good illustration there, too, about the girl who woke up for class late.
Yeah.
Talking about what it means to really rest, like to have authentic rest, genuine rest. Like waking up for class late, rushing to the bathroom, and then realizing it's Saturday morning, you can fall back into bed and really go back to sleep and just really rest or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget to turn your clock ahead this weekend, and that'll be us.
Speaking about that, that's exactly right. I'm glad you mentioned that.
I didn't even realize until this morning. I think I saw it on the news.
Yeah, the church that I used to pastor, I'm still on their email list. I get all their announcements, and I just got one today, thankfully, that said, don't forget this coming weekend is turn your clocks ahead hour, you lose an hour of sleep. I was like, yikes. So
yeah, no kidding.
But like he says, none of us identifies with unreal or exaggerated or official, right? Or artificial, but really the real actually does hit us in the gut, so to speak. And then he says, narration and descriptions are with emotional restraint and an economy of words. This counsel continues the caution about realism, but needs to be underscored. Listeners tend to lean into narratives that have an emotional force, but are when presented with emotional restraint. He says, if a speaker tries to milk all the emotion out of an event, emotion becomes emotionalism. And boy, haven't we seen that in preaching. Some of these, TV evangelists and whatnot, it's kind of contrived and you kind of know it, So. Events, he says, also viewed with a single perspective unless the hearer is instructed otherwise. When treating an event or a narrative or biblical story, it's best for the preacher to stand in one place throughout the message. When he means stand in one place, it's not like standing in the pulpit, although that's probably a good idea when you're actually preaching instead of doing a whole lot of walking around. Walking around doesn't, as long as it doesn't distract, is not problematic, but trying to be in the pulpit, your position of authority, naming and claiming your space, that's important. But what he's talking about here is bouncing around from perspective to perspective in the story, right? This is what Jesus thought. This is what Judas was thinking. This is what Simon Peter was thinking while all of this was going on. It's a little bit much to be bouncing all around like that. Might be better to talk about Jesus's perspective, and you can talk about what Judas did and what Peter did, but you're staying seated with Jesus through this thing, right? It's in through his eyes you're here. The next time you preach this same passage, you might come at it with Judas's perspective, and you're moving and you stay there. But as he says, a single perspective in the narration or in the narrative. I think that's important. The choice of the perspective is determined by the desire to hear and receive the story. Once the choice is made, looking at the parable from other angles should be reserved for other sermons. I underlined that sentence.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. And the illustration he gives right under that sentence is important. If you've ever been to a concert or like the opera, he says nobody can experience the concert in the same way from the wings, the balcony, the orchestra pit, and the front row all at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a perspective on each one of those, and there's certain limitations and whatnot. So you can only be in one place at one time. It's kind of emotionally disorienting to your people if you're constantly moving them around in the auditorium, right? Mm-hmm. And then the last one, he says, as much as possible, the sermon material is re-experienced as it is related. In other words, the speaker functions from within the sermon, the result being that the hearer tends to do the same. Of course, some of the content is information and historical reporting, but even much of that can be presented with an emphatic imagination, right? Whether joy, anger, sorrow, disgust, indignation, listeners naturally respond, and usually with some degree of identification. And then anticipation. What did y'all think about that? How did you read that?
Yeah, I mean, you trying to hold the hearer, I guess, and hold their attention and not get the sense of being complete in failure of your message.
Right.
Anticipation enables us to ride out the storm, endure periods of pain and privation. Stick with the tasteful and boring tasks, maintain sanity in chaos, and survive disappointments and delays in pursuit of our goals. It's hard.
Yeah, I wrote that. I think I underlined that too, but I'm trying to find it. I don't see it right this second, but
it's right.
Page 166.
166.
Yeah, like the where the first paragraph starts on that page.
Okay.
I think it's like the second sentence there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I actually got it. I do have it parentheses, and I got VIP in the margin beside it. Very important.
Yeah.
And the reason I missed it is because I did it, went ahead and circled the whole first sentence to go along with it. It is difficult to overstate the vital role of anticipation in human life. And then, like you said, Jacob, it does allow us to ride out the storm, periods of pain and privation, stick with a distasteful and boring task, and maintain sanity and chaos and all of these things. In addition, it is probably the human spirit's greatest resource or source of pleasure, often exceeding that provided by the fulfillment of one's anticipation. So the anticipation oftentimes is more exciting than actually when it actually happens, right?
Yeah.
It's like, man, I was so looking forward to this cruise to the Bahamas, and I really enjoyed the Bahamas. Don't get me wrong, but man, looking forward to it was more, it built it up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually got another one I marked at the bottom of that same page. It's the last sentence or two in that last paragraph before it starts actually on that first sentence at the bottom of the page. It says, the old fiction that awkwardness, credulity, tastelessness are more honest, prophetic, and Christian than skill, timing, and appropriateness is still alive and well, and probably will remain so as long as laziness can disguise itself acceptably as religious conviction. And so, he talked about, throughout this book, he's talked about not just utilizing the idea that to be able to be an authentic preacher, you've got to just let the Holy Spirit have his way. And I'm not going to do anything until Sunday morning at 9:45 to get ready for this message. That way God can really work. And as he says, that's really being lazy and dishonest. And he said, in fact, in one of the places, I underlined it, but maybe we've already gone past it, and maybe it's in the next chapter. I can't remember. But he said, to be effectively used by the Holy Spirit, you need to pray as if everything depends on God. And then you need to work as if everything depends on you, and give God that room in between the two to work and move and to be dynamic. So. And I think it's important what he says on the top of the next page, to building the anticipation into one's preaching simply calls for one basic understanding of the task of the pulpit. The goal is not to get something said, but to get something heard.
Yeah.
And when we're getting ready to preach, we've worked all week long, like, we've talked about throughout this class thus far, pulling together the meat of the sermon, like what is the message? And now that we've got the message, it's burning in our chest. And it's like Jeremiah when he's told God, I will not preach in your name anymore. And then he's like, I can't not do that. I'm burning in my bones. I got to speak, right? Sometimes getting in the sermon, in the pulpit and preaching is so cathartic to us that we forget that the purpose of the preaching and talking is not for us to get it out, which it is a good thing for us. It is a release and a catharsis, but that's not what it's about, right? What it's really about is that they hear what we're trying to get out. And if we don't do that, then we failed in our work. So trying to remember that, and then thinking about utilizing anticipation to hold them on the edge of their seats. And man, I'm telling you what, that last paragraph on page 167, that caught my attention again as I reread through this chapter today, just to refresh my memory so we could talk about it tonight. It caught me the first time I read it. It caught me again tonight. He says, near the end of his life, Carl Sandburg, a historian, poet, and entertainer, was asked by a reporter, what was your opinion, the ugliest word in the English language? Well, it takes an entire paragraph for him to unpack that, right?
Yeah.
Because the anticipation keeps building as I'm looking at this in my mind, like the whole thing is playing out like on TV in my mind. I'm watching this reporter ask him that, and I'm looking at the guy, and he's doing this like, the ugliest word. Ugliest. And I'm sitting there like, what's he going to say? I'm like at the edge of my seat. My anticipation is building up, I want to hear what he's got to say. And he finally says it, right? Exclusive, right? Like you're going to exclude somebody out of being able to be included. And I'm like, wow. And he says, into a nest of anticipation built entirely on restraint, he dropped the word, and years later, it still stays there in the mind of the people who've heard this story, right? So you see how when he says into the nest that he built entirely by restraint, like most of us are so, we don't have that restraint. So when we're asked the question, the first thing we do is pop off the first thing that comes off the top of our mind because we want to show that we know, right? It's like, well, I know what I'm talking about. I know exactly what you want to hear. Let me tell you what my answer to that question is. But this guy's like acting all, he might not have been acting. Maybe he really was thinking, but even if he knew what he wanted to say, he was acting all pensive and thoughtful, right? He's like, and he's weaving that nest of anticipation. I actually wrote wow in the margin of my book because I thought it was powerful.
Yeah, it is.
I think Craddock kind of did that in that sermon, don't y'all?
Yeah.
I think he did that a couple of times. He's like, there's questions that he asked that seem to keep building the anticipation of the congregation, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And then that kind of go into that next section, Dr. Cox, the intimacy. Where it's talking about not constantly referring and if you over refer to like yourself and your experience and your family and your kids and your whatever, fill in the blank, and you keep referencing that, and kind of takes away from the listener's ability to connect and attach to it.
Yes, and it proves that you don't know your people as well as you should as a shepherd, because that's what he gets to when the whole point of the topic is intimacy, right? Mm-hmm. And so if every sermon illustration you use, or 80% of them you use, are about your kids and your wife and yourself and all the things that you've experienced in life, then basically what you're telling everybody is, I don't know y'all well enough to share any of y'all's, our common experiences, but here's what me and my family experience at home all during the week when I don't see any of you. So it's almost like it's a self-confession. I live in a cave, right? On Sunday morning, I see all of y'all, and then I go home and I don't see you again until next Sunday. It's like, that's really a poor pastor. He talks about having lives that are woven together all through the week in such a way that there's an intimacy built that you can actually talk about, the experiences of the community. Then you don't have to lean only on your own. And basically, he talks about, too, how that's tied to the spoken word, right? Orality. Like, instead of written. That's important. Unconsciously, intense listeners respond bodily with eye, face, and lip movements, which, even if barely visible, register the degree of involvement. So, if you're a preacher at all, if you've ever done a lot of speaking and you kind of keep an eye on the congregation as you're speaking, because it is an oral exchange, like there's communication going both ways, even in churches that people don't talk. A lot of times you hear people say, well, I don't like preaching at that church. Those Presbyterians, man, they never say amen. They never shout. They never lift their hand. They never do anything evocative. I can't tell whether they're getting it or not. Well, if you pay attention, you can, because even in the Presbyterian church, which I preached at Mount Olive Presbyterian Church when I first resigned Wintergreen for like 3 months, almost every Sunday, they kept calling me to come back and help them, and I did. And I got to know those people really well. And man, just a little head nod or like this right here, it's like, that person is not fully getting what you're saying. They're not jiving. Maybe they don't even believe it. They're like, I don't know if I go along with that or not. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's constant feedback from the congregation, even if it's unconscious and it's slight. But you got to be a person that can actually recognize that, if you're going to get that feedback.
I bet it's harder in today's environment than it has been 20 years ago, too, because you got people like me that are sitting there taking notes on my phone. You don't know if that person's sitting there texting somebody, watching a game, or they're actually taking notes.
That's right. That's right.
They're doing something. So, I mean, I guess in my mind, I'm going to be like, well, they're taking notes.
Well, most of the time, I try to give the congregants the benefit of the doubt. And if somebody is really taking notes, most of the time they're looking down while they're taking notes, but they're looking back up and they're actually connecting in such a way that you know they're connecting. If they're texting, they're usually like,
just straight down. Yeah, that's true.
It's like they're in their own little world and they're laughing and they're making all kinds of emotive remarks to their phone, and you're like, maybe they're texting you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yep.
But in the end of the day, this chapter, and you start to think about what he's talking about is shaping the message. It's all about how to overcome any barrier from your people hearing the message, right? And that's what he's going to continue on into in the next chapter, the formation of the sermon. But really, he's talking about right now, hey, here's some things that the sermon, no matter what form it takes, probably should have, right? It should have memory. It should have recall. It should have scripture that these people are identifying with, and that they actually know that this is like who they are. And that's built in that intimacy of the giving and the taking of the congregation, the living together in koinonia as a faith community. If you've got all those things sort of like baked in, that's good. And then you can move to the next section, which is the forming of the sermon, right? And the formation of it. So let me just stop there first before we jump into chapter 9. Anything on chapter 8 that we didn't talk about that you wanted to?
I'm good.
Okay, Jacob, good? All right, well, let's look at the formation then of the sermon. Sermon comes in many different forms, and this is not like preaching was taught years ago, and you would probably be given a certain way to do things like how to outline a sermon and like make introduction, point 1, ABC, point 2, ABC, point 3, ABC, and then a conclusion, right? Mm-hmm. And that was like the major form. And then a lot of people started joking like, it's not a sermon if it don't have 3 points and a poem, right? Yeah. But in all honesty, that's too limiting to put a particular way that you should preach every week. Yeah. You really should be free to move with the actual text itself and the demands of the message that you're trying to convey through orality, to be able to come up with different, new, and fresh forms. And sometimes the text itself gives you the form, right? And he talks about that in here too. He's like, how could you possibly read certain stories where Jesus gives a story in a particular form, like parable, and then say that there's any other form that's better to relate that than parable? So maybe the best thing to do is just work through that mode or that form of literature, parable, to help the congregation come to the same experience that Jesus' first hearers would have had when Jesus told it. Does that make sense? So you don't want to go out looking for a new form to fit a form that the Bible already says this is one of the better forms for this particular message.
Right.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of the different forms of the text itself. On page 171, he said, the early church existed as an oral community prior to and parallel to its life as a written or reading community. And the New Testament carries over into its text these oral forms which the faith was shared through. And they are these: gospel, miracle story, parable, proverb, aphorism, pronouncements, resurrection stories that bear the marks of oral circulation. Some others that the church actually incorporated into their written life, but they were also oral too, are hymnal, like singing, creeds, creedal statements, baptismal formulas, prayers, and doxologies, right? Mm-hmm. I think I just remembered the one that he was talking about, how could you use a different form? It was the Sermon on the Mount. It says, blessed are the poor, right? And he said that is actually in the form of a blessing. So don't take that and turn it into an exclamatory remark that says you must be poor, right? He said the best way to preach that particular verse is just the way Jesus did. Just make the pronouncement that poor people are blessed. Don't think that they're not blessed just because they don't have money, right? So be careful about changing the form, and just realize that form actually communicates. On page 172 at the bottom of the page, he says, as a frame does for a picture, the pattern for the sermon serves to arrest, accent, focus, and aid the listener's apprehension of the message. Let us then keep in mind that form gains and holds interest. For example, observing the principal end of end stress withholds the point of primary interest until the end. Recall two examples, the parable of Luke 15, concerned with the lost and found, and then he goes on and gives that illustration, and then another one. But the one he's talking about, the lost and found, he's talking about the prodigal son, and he says, this my son who was dead, who was lost and now is found, right? So this is my son who was alive and was dead, which that sounds pretty dramatic, right? But the ending is he was lost and now is found. That's even more dramatic than the dead and now alive again, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
He said, don't confuse forms by trying, for example, to introduce historical facts with words like once upon a time, right? Because we know that today the form once upon a time means what? Fairy tale, not factual. So why would you try to introduce a factual story with a once upon a time form? You're subtly telling the congregation, don't believe this isn't true, right? Once upon a time, little Miss Muffet sat upon a tuffet, blah, 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 blah. It's a nursery rhyme. It's a tale. It's not meant to be taken seriously. So you don't want to say, once upon a time, Ronald Reagan was America's president.
Yeah.
Well, technically it's true, but you've just put it in a form that makes people think that it's a joke or that it's, that it's somehow false. So don't confuse the forms, because you can actually miscommunicate what you're actually trying to communicate. Some of the phrases that gave you form in the Bible, he says, and I highlighted these two, that's on page 173, right above that quote I just made, once upon a time, but then there was a certain man, right? Dearly beloved, we are gathered here. There was two Irishmen, Pat and Mike, who went into a bar or whatever. I being of sound mind do hereby, inasmuch as the party of the first part has testified. Each one of those you can find a form for, right? You know it off the top of your head. The two Irishmen, Pat and Mike, is probably a joke about Irishmen or something like that. Dearly beloved, we're gathered here is either a very formal solemnity type service of a funeral or a wedding, right? The former party, inasmuch as testified to the first party, blah, 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 that's a legal document. So the form actually kind of gives you more information than the actual, then you wouldn't even have to read the rest of it. You kind of know what they're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm. I looked at that page 174. It says form determines the degree of participation demanded of the hearers.
Yeah.
Where some don't require anything from the listeners and others will.
Correct.
And then he goes into, giving some examples of those where he talks about the parable makes a lesser demand, but yet it's still enough that the listener has a role to play in that.
Exactly. But a riddle would make a huge demand because basically you're like asking a question that if they don't answer, I'm not going to give you the answer to, right? It's like all the weight's on you guys at this point now. I've given you my riddle. You got to come up with the answer to it.
Right.
And he said with most this was the quote just in front of where you started reading just a minute ago, Jonathan. I actually highlighted this one. With most listeners, a change of form is equivalent to a change of content. That's important if you believe that preaching the Bible is preaching God's word. and you don't want to change. How many have you heard a preacher stand up and say, I'm just going to preach the word of God, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it, and I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to. But then if they change the form, then they actually did change it, right? So careful. He says, quote, but it didn't seem like a sermon, they said of the new minister's message, which was no less biblical, no less relevant, no less theologically sound than those to which they were accustomed. Why did it not seem like a sermon? Because for them, the change of form seemed like a change in content. But he gave a good speech, but I don't particularly think that that was a sermon. Well, maybe that's because we've been shaped to believe how a sermon is supposed to be based on some preacher that we've heard all of our life who has 3 points and a poem. You know, if that other preacher doesn't give it in 3 points and a poem, then it's not preaching.
That's right. Yeah.
But maybe it is preaching if the definition of preaching is simply the raising or the elevating of the voice and articulating the gospel, right? Or calling, you know, speaking prophetically and calling people to account on God's behalf. One final example is the refrain. He says the recurring phrase or line, more common to church music than to preaching, even though it holds real promise for sermons. The refrain can function as an amen, a word of confirmation or agreement spoken by either the preacher or the congregation. It may also serve as a unify a number of units material that has a common theme. I would say he probably did that too in that sermon about salvation that I forwarded you last week, right? The refrain was Jesus saves.
Yeah.
And that's how he said it too. He didn't say Jesus saves. Nope. It's not a question, right? It was a punctiliar in the sentence, put a period there. Right. It is what it is. Jesus saves. He heals.
Very matter of fact.
Yeah. Very matter of fact, exactly. So a refrain can be a very powerful way of like bringing a sermon back to its theme or its title. All right, let's look over to the section, a selection of a form.
Yeah, he speaks of the adequacy of form.
Yep.
That some are not, which is true. And then he goes into the congeniality of form.
Yep.
To imply that some are not, which is also is true.
That's right.
I had that in my notes.
How about the illustration he gives about Joshua's speech there? And he says, such a message would be blurred and confused by anything other than a twofold structure, a yes or no. Choose you this day who you will serve, you know, but for me and my house, it'd be God. It's like there's only an either or opportunity here. There's not a, you know, you can't make a form where there's a plethora of different, well, maybe, I might, okay, let me think about it. There's no question. There's no think about it. There's no maybe. You know, this is one of those, like, when you call somebody to be saved, and they're like, you know what, I'm almost saved, but I'm not quite saved. Well, if you're almost saved, you're totally lost. You know, I mean, it's like there's no in between here. What was it Agrippa said to Paul? And he probably said it more sarcastically than it comes across, because a lot of preachers have preached it. You know, it's like, oh, Agrippa was so close to being saved. He told Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian, you know. Well, it very well may be that Agrippa was actually saying it like, yeah, you almost got me, Paul, but nah. You know, it's like probably not as close as what we think. But still, in the end of the day, almost persuaded means totally not persuaded, right?
Yeah. One way or the other, yeah.
Right. It's either or. And you can't change that form. If you change the form, you change the content. So he gives us a list on page 177. The sentence on 176 is connected to it, the last one. From such a supply of forms, many of us recognize and perhaps have used some of the following. What is it? what is it worth? How does one get it? Or explore, explain, apply, right? That's almost like that expository preaching I was telling you about before, where you go through each verse and you explore it and explain it, and then say, okay, here's the life application of how we can put this into our lives. The problem, you set up the problem, and then you give the solution at the end of the message, right? What it is not and what it is, like that's negation and affirmation, I think. Either or, both and, promise fulfillment, ambiguity towards clarity, major premise, minor premise, then finally a conclusion. Not this, not that, but this instead, right? The flashback from the present to the past, back to the present again, or from lesser to greater. And that lesser to greater, I think, is one of the illustrations he gave us in this actual chapter when he said that Jesus' legs were broken. Like the form of that story in the gospel is that Jesus' legs were broken. He said they went by, if they wanted to make sure that they were dead in crucifixion, they break the criminal's legs. So they went to the guy on the left, and then they went all the way back to the guy on the right, and they broke their legs. And then they went to Jesus to break his legs, but he was already dead, right? So the lesser to the greater, if it went to, in the writing, if it went to Jesus first and he was already dead and didn't break his legs, well, why would we want to hear about guys getting their legs broke on either side, right? Mm-hmm. It don't matter. So from lesser to greater. So these are just some of the different forms that he's suggesting that can be used, right? Mm-hmm. And when you get to this point in sermon preparation, I mean, this is the question that you need to be asking yourself. Like, which one of these forms actually kind of fits the message? Like, is it, what is the message? Do you know what the message is? Hopefully you've got the message by now. And now you've actually started looking at how you're going to communicate this message in an oral environment, not written. Okay, if that's what you're wanting to communicate, how's the best way to communicate it? Not how's the best way to say it, because it really might be, like I said a moment ago, very cathartic for you to actually get up there and say it in one form, but the congregation might not hear it in that form at all. And that's happened many times before when the preacher wants to get up there and just lambaste the congregation. I've heard preachers in our denomination actually say that if you ain't busted their hide with a bullwhip and rubbed salt in it, then you've not preached. Well, that's more for the preacher than it is for the congregation. Because the preacher has this desire to want to bust somebody's hide with a bullwhip and rub salt in it. And that's not going to help anybody probably hear a message, right? They're probably going to shut down. They're probably going to get very defensive. They're like, who does he think he's talking to? You know, so have you really accomplished what God has called you to do? If he's called you to communicate, if what you're doing is just kind of alleviating some type of internal desire to just get them told, you know?
Yeah.
What else did y'all find that was interesting in this last section here? I got a couple other things that are highlighted I could talk about, but I don't want to take the entirety of the conversation.
Let's see. The section where it was talking about creating the form.
Uh-huh.
It's in page 183. The effectiveness of the sermon soon to be preached will in large measure depend on these two factors: the capacity to anticipate the listener's response and the capacity to shape the sermon to meet the challenge of that anticipated response.
Basically what I just got through saying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, every Sunday I had a couple of congregants in my church for years that I knew were very, very conservatives. I mean, like they came from a almost fundamentalist church. And in my mind, my gauge was almost always, if they could hear this, then everybody else in the congregation can hear it. But if they can't hear it, then, you know, they're going to sit there like this the entire time. And their body language is going to cause almost everybody else in the whole congregation to just tune out, because they're going to be like, well, what's their problem? They don't act like they're jiving with this message, right? Mm-hmm. But my mind was always anticipating what were their critiques. What would they say if I said this? And I was trying to always avoid that controversy of an argument after the sermon was over, not because I was trying to slight the gospel, because like he said, we're not talking about changing what you actually say because you're scared somebody's not going to like it. He says we're talking about changing the form of how you say what you say so that they'll hear it, whether they like it or not. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Anything else? He does kind of, in the latter section of this chapter, begin to talk about thinking through the sermon as an oral delivery, and not being so worried about it being a written document. That on page 188, I think it is, he said, when the preacher thinks in this fashion about the task of the pulpit, usually there's not any premature search for an outline or listing of points, quote unquote. Questions such as these, how many points should a sermon have, die from neglect because the preacher's not really thinking as a speech writer, but as a pastor and prophet. Before the first word of the sermon is spoken, the preacher has a clear idea of the listener's posture of mind and heart in relation to the message that is delivered. In order to shape that message into a sermon, the task of the day is fixed in mind. Today's text and message will meet the misunderstanding, apathy, lack of information, skillful avoidance, resentment, indifference, defiance, disagreement, total approval, too easily agreed to, and countless other mindsets. Beginning at the intersection of this message, the hearer, the sermon begins to unfold, moving from where they are through the text, using analogies, examples, images, perhaps even pleasant interruptions in the form of an aside or a hint of the road not now to be taken until the preacher and the congregation know the message has been said, right? So I think that's important, that you're thinking through it as an oral delivery of a sermon that's coming out, and it's an interchange between you and the congregation, so that you're not so much worried about what's actually being written down. You're asking yourself, how is this going to be heard? How is this going to be accepted? Are they going to actually apply it and begin to utilize it in their life? Because that's what a sermon is ultimately going to do, right? It's going to call people to make changes in how they live.
Yes.
And even he says on page 189, for the listener, even another preacher that's listening in the congregation, not to have discerned the outline may be a high compliment to the energy, interest, movement, and compelling force of the sermon. In other words, if you've made that outline structured into that sermon in such a fashion that you can deliver it and nobody even knows there really was an outline, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And then he says, when you actually do finally write down the sermon, the goal on page 190 at the very top, he says the goal is to preach. So writing is a servant, nothing more, nothing less of that goal. Let a preacher begin thinking of the point is to get Sunday's sermon written and not a string of negative results follow. In the first place, the written sermon is a kind of closure which offers not only the sense of satisfaction, thank God I'm finally finished with that, but it is also a shutting down of the germination and gestation period, often prematurely. So once you get the sermon written, if that's what the goal is to write a sermon, then you're not even thinking about it, because okay, now I got my sermon down on paper. All I'm going to do is go to church, I'm going to read it. Yeah. But if it's the goal of it is to actually preach, then the actual writing is to serve that purpose, right? So like he says, you might only write down on the paper like bullet points, like something that will spark an entire imaginative moment so that you can talk sort of extemporaneously because of the study that you've done. And you're talking as an educated person because you studied it, right? You're not just spouting off the top of your head.
Right.
Now, I personally do write my sermons out, and he says that on page 191. Some preachers will protest. I always write out my sermons in full. I was taught to do so and would be rambling blabberer without it. And that's probably the case with me. I've kind of tied my hands to the written manuscript, so I preach. But when I preach, I don't read it word for word necessarily. I glance down and I'll see a topic, and as I do, I'll look up and I'll actually expound on that topic based on what I probably wrote. But I kind of have committed it to memory enough because of the study all week long and preparing for the orality of the event.
Mm-hmm.
And on page 192, he gives like five different things to think through when you're getting ready to put pen to paper. He says, first, write and place front and center in the text the theme, the sentence, and the subject. You write and put front and center, those three things, that'll keep them in the forefront of your mind. As you mentally walk through the message, he says, list phrases down the page in the basic information of ideas, like I said a moment ago, maybe even a bullet point, and not even a finality of it, just to say, I'm willing to change this if it actually is necessitated. Third, he says, ask of each item, is that information clear? Is it relevant? Is it needed? Does it need an illustration or analogy? And does it need to be just scratched out completely? Fourth, he says, write in full sentences or even brief paragraphs the particular portions of the sermon in which the path of thought is narrow or difficult to follow, so that you make sure that you break that tension for the people so that you can actually clarify what you're actually getting across. And then finally, let the mind move through what now remains from the scribbling, striking through and rearranging, and look again to the statement of the text, the theme, and the subject, and ask, does this sermon now treat this text, convey that theme, and develop that subject? And if you can say all of that, like he says, you pretty much got yourself in a good shape. So, any other thoughts about that chapter before we kind of just have a few moments and close out?
No.
I don't think so.
All right. Well, what I've done is I failed to hit record like for the first maybe 10 minutes of our conversation, but I did hit record. I remembered to hit record after that. So I'm going to record. I'm going to upload this video to the Moodle shell later tonight or tomorrow. Depends on how long it takes to upload. My internet here is sometimes horribly slow, and it takes a while to upload a video to YouTube. But once I get it uploaded, you can go back and you can play this over if you need to, just to kind of re-unpack it or anything. But otherwise, I think we're all good to go.
Next Friday. What time?
Let's see. What day was that? Let's make sure we got the date right.
The 15th.
15. Yeah, so next week we will meet on the 14th, which is our fourth night of class, and then Friday the 15th will be our day, right? What time did we say? Did we mention a time?
I don't remember.
I've got it booked from 12 noon till 5. So what time would be best for all you, for each of you?
I'm good between that whole time. What about you, John?
I'm as well. So
okay.
I have class till 12:20 in their choir, but I mean I can stay right after. It doesn't matter.
let's just shoot for that then. Let's say 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock. Okay.
That gives the choir time to get out of there, and we should be good to go then. If anything changes between now and then, I'll let you know. But 1 o'clock, that way we can go ahead and get done. It's going to be Friday afternoon. I'm sure everybody's going to be home before 5 o'clock. So if we can get you guys to both preach both sermons, you'll preach your narrative sermon first each, and you'll critique each other. And then we'll preach the gospel sermon each, and we'll critique each other, and then we'll be done. And that'll be our last class.
Is it just us three?
Yeah.
Sweet.
As far as I know. Now, of course, it's Friday afternoon, and if there's students that are hanging around, Jeremiah's there on campus, and he doesn't have anywhere he's got to go. So, anybody who wants to come in, Miss Carla may come in if she's there, or John or Tiana. But I doubt it because Friday afternoon, most everybody's ready to skedaddle if they can.
Okay.
Okay.
all right.
All right, gentlemen. Well, I will see you on next Thursday if I don't see you before, and just give me a holler if you need me between now and then, okay?
Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Knox. Good seeing you, Jacob.
See you,
Bye.
brother.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.